Okay, so the next topic for literary criticism is about psychoanalytic theory by Sigmund Freud. So this psychoanalytic theory criticism by Sigmund Freud in his structural model theory of personality states that each individual's personality is made of three parts, which is the ego, the superego, and the id. So these three together works to make complex human personality. Thus, psychoanalysis is the procedure of applying what humans know about these three parts of one's personality and to discover the ways of how a person behaves. So, kaning literary critics, it often analyzes the actions of the literary characters based on how the person behaves by applying the three personality structures which is mentioned, the ego, the superego, and the id. So as critics explore the ego, superego, and id of characters in the literary work, they stress on the ways on how these parts based on the behaviors of the characters and consequently affect the work as a whole. So this process is called psychoanalytic criticism by Wally 2011. Also added by Hossein 2017 that psychoanalysis is the theory modern theory is used in literature and has two basic meanings. First, it's used as methods of treating mental disordered people, and second, it is used to explain human mind and its various complexities. So, psychoanalysis is not just simply remain the branch of medicine, it has been used to help people understand various fields, such as philosophy, culture, religion, and first, for which is ginagamit yun siya likely is sa literature. And then psychoanalytic criticism by Hussein is that psychoanalysis is regarded one of the interesting and um, satisfying approach in the application of interpretative analysis because psychoanalysis is among one of the modern theories used in literary analysis for whether it close connection with literature that has been most controversial for many people. It is least appreciated in spite of being one of the most famous approach for interpreting a literary text. So let us now proceed to the historical background or the timeline of Sigmund Freud. So he is Sigismund or later changed to Sigmund Freud. He was born on May 6 and his father was a merchant during this time. And during 1860s, they moved to Leipzig and then settled in Vienna. So where Freud was educated. So Freud's family were Jewish, but he himself was not practicing or not practicing. So Freud's family moved to Vienna, Austria when he was only 4 years old. So Vienna came his lifelong home and the center of his academic and professional career. So it was here that he developed most of his theories and established psychoanalysis as a discipline. During 1873, he studied medicine at the University of Vienna, and then after graduating na dayon, he worked at Vienna General Hospital. He collaborated with Joseph Breuer in treating hysteria by recalling the painful experiences under hypnosis. And then during the 1886, Freud went to Paris as a student of neurologist Jean Chariot. And during this time, he returned to Vienna in the following year, and Freud set up a private practice specializing in nervous and brain disorders. And the same year, he married Martha Bernays, with whom he had 6 children. And then during the 1887, he started experimenting with hypnotic suggestion wherein gistadihan niya ang mga tao nga naay mga psychological disorders. This method involved putting patients into a trance-like state of access, hidden thoughts, and memories. However, he moved away from hypnosis when he found it was limited. And then during the 1890s, Freud began using the cathartic method. So kaning cathartic method, it involves encouraging patients to talk about the traumatic experiences to release emotional tension and also This approach laid the foundation for would later become the talk therapy, and it emphasizes the importance of expressing the repressed emotions of the human who experience a um, traumatic situations. And then next is during the 1895, Freud is published studies on hysteria with Joseph Brewer. And then during sa 1895, iya ang work nga hysteria with collaborate ni Joseph. So this is the work that introduced the idea that the psychological symptoms could caused by unconscious mind or unconscious conflicts, and it is considered one of the earliest works in psychoanalysis. So ang hysteria is one of the first works by Sigmund Freud. And then during the 1986, Freud had coined the term psychoanalysis, and he worked and explored it in the next 40 years of his life to develop principles, method, and techniques for it. So in these 40 years, si Freud, he was able to detail many theories of his thought on his mental life. So Freud also developed the theory of that humans have unconscious in which sexual and aggressive impulses are in perpetual conflict for supremacy with the defenses against them. And then during the 1897, he began an intensive analysis of himself, wherein si Freud began analyzing his own dreams and thoughts and childhood experiences. So this self-analysis helped him develop his key theories that is later on prevalent, being used for literary critics, and then it includes the Oedipus Rex, Oedipus complex, and it also strengthened his belief in the importance of the unconscious mind. And then during the 190s, the interpretation of dream was published. So kaning the interpretation of dreams, Freud analyzed dreams in terms of unconscious desires and experiences. In this book, he introduces nga ang dream. It reveals the unconscious desires and conflicts of people, and it also a dream analysis is a central technique in psychoanalysis. During the 1902, Freud was appointed professor of neuropathology at the University of Vienna. So, na-appoint si Freud as professor and University of Vienna. So, a post he held until 1938. So, the medical establishment disagreed with many of his theories. So, that's why a group of pupils and followers began to gather around Freud. And then during the 1905, he published three essays on the theory of sexuality and jokes under relation to the unconsciousness. So kaning iyahang work, it explored human sexuality and how conscious thoughts paunsa ka influence sa humor and behavior sa usa ka tawo. They were controversial and highly influential during this time. And then paabot na sa 1908, the first International Psychoanalytic Congress. So diri din nahitabo, and it was held in Salzburg. This event marked the growing recognition of psychoanalysis as legitimate field of the study. It also nakatabang pud ni ang yang first International Psychoanalytic Congress in order nga mahimong mo spread o ma-recognize ang iyaang psychoanalytic works across Europe. And then during the 1914, his work on narcissism. So kaning narcissism, he first introduced this concept of self-love and the idea of the ego ideal. So this later contributed to his theory of superego, and it expanded his understanding of the personality structure. And then during the 1915 to 1917, an introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. So Freud delivered a series of lectures in the University of Vienna. So later he published introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, wherein ang kaninga lectures made his theories more accessible to students and to the public. So they help popularize the psychoanalysis worldwide. And then during the 1920, he published Beyond the Pleasure Principle, wherein the culture that he introduced the concept of death instinct. He suggests that humans have an unconscious drive toward destruction and self-destruction. So this idea added complexity to his either theories about pleasure and survival. And then during the 1921, group psychology and the analysis of the ego. So Freud explored how individuals behave in a group. He examined how social influences affect the mind and personality. So this work is connected to psychoanalysis and social psychology. And then after the World War One, Freud spent most of his time in clinical observations, and he is more concentrated on the application of his theories to history, art, literature, and anthropology. And then during the 1923, the ego and the id. So he published The Ego and the Id, which suggests a new structural model of the mind. So it's divided into the id, the ego, and the superego. So eventually, this psychoanalysis became famous by 1925, and it was established around the world as a successful movement. So though Freud was considered radical by many in his profession, but he was soon accepted and well known worldwide as leading expert in the field of psychoanalysis. And then during the 1926, the inhibitions of symptoms and anxiety. So Freud revise his earlier ideas about the anxiety, which is ang anxiety theory, which is he explained how anxiety arises from internal conflicts within the mind. This work deepened his understanding of mental disorders of the people. And then during the 1927 is The Future of Illusion, which is one of the works na published ni Freud, when he argued that religion is a human creation based on psychological needs. He viewed it as an illusion rather than a scientific truth. So that's why his work is controversial, but it also reflected his rational and critical approach. Next is during the 1933, which is the Nazis publicly burned a number of Freud's books. So the Nazis publicly burned a number of Freud's book, and then during the 1938, shortly after the Nazis annexed the Austria, Freud left Vienna for London, his wife and daughter daughter Anna. So Freud had been diagnosed with cancer of the jaw during the 1923, and then underwent more than 30 operations, and he died on cancer on September 23, 1939. So that's the historical background of Sigmund Freud. So next is the features and characteristic of psychoanalysis. So according to Freud, the id is the part of personality that holds our basic desires, so such as thirst, anger, hunger, and the desire for instant fulfillment of release. Freud believed that humans are innate with their id, and the id is a vital part of our personality since as infants, and it allows us to get our primitive needs met. So, with the establishment sa id, he believed that id is the basis of on our desire principle. So the id wants whatever feels worthy at a time, with no concern for other state or affairs of the situation. So as id had the power to influence the ego and can easily bring self pleasure, and this sometimes described as the devil sitting on somebody's shoulder. And it's also supported by a research guide on 2010 nga kaning as the devil sits there, he tells the ego to base performance on how the actions will affect the self, specifically how it bring the self pleasure. So kaning id is nag-focus niya sa ato ang mga desires, and it is believed that nanatay id since as infants, and allows us to get our primitive needs in order nga masatisfy ang ato ang self. So next structural model of personality is the superego. So the superego is part of the personality that embodies the conscience and the moral part of us. So according to Research Guide 2010, the superego telling the person to control the ego's behaviors and to base behavior in a way that the action is influenced by moral part of human personality. So kaning superego is our conscience. As we do something, so it is our conscience that will trigger us, or that will um so next feature or characteristic of psychoanalytic is the unconscious, which is the human mind is divided to three regions. The conscious, next is the preconscious, or also known as subconscious, and then the unconscious. So kaning conscious is where individuals' current thoughts, feelings, and effort live. The preconscious, also known as subconscious, is, according to Freud, it is a living place for things, individual that can recall or retrieve from his or her memory. And then the last is a consciousness, which is the deepest level exists, which most of the time we are unaware of it. So it is important to understand the importance of the notions of the unconsciousness, because this unconsciousness, according to Freud, is a stock of feelings, which is our thoughts, our memories that are outside of our conscious awareness. So most of matters of the unconsciousness are unacceptable or unpleasant, such as the feelings of anxiety, pain, or clash. So under the unconsciousness is we have the repression, or it is the act to keep information and memories far from conscious awareness. So individuals keeping away memories from his or her conscious awareness, and these memories don't just disappear, but they remain to affect our actions. So there's this kind of experiences that we tend to just forget, but we can't deny the fact that it can affect our actions. So that's why we have also suppression, which is occasionally we fix this consciously by driving the unwelcome information out of our consciousness. So that's why we don't really think of the memories that will unlikely um make us unwelcome those thoughts that seems unpleasant to us. And then next is we have one of the features and characteristic of the psychoanalytic that includes is the Oedipal complex, which is Sigmund Freud used to term in his theory of psychosexual stages of growth that describes a desire feelings of a boy for his mother. So anger and jealousy towards his father, and basically the feeling which a boy has towards his father is that he feels like he is a rival with his father for possessiveness of his own mother. So according to Freud, the boy wishes to possess his mother and replace himself to his father. So he view his father as a rival for his mother's fondness. So the Oedipal complex happens in a phallic stage of psychosexual development between the ages of 3 and 5. So next is we have the Electra complex, which is also a phallic stage, which shows significant point of developing the sexual identity, wherein a young girl, feel desire for their father and being jealous of their mother. So another features and characteristic of the psychoanalytic is the defenses, which is the process through which the issues of our unconsciousness are retained in the unconscious. So defenses include selective perceptions, that is seeing and hearing only those we feel and we can handle. So, or we're just having a selective memory, which is modifying our memories so that we don't feel overwhelmed by them or feel painful. So we are trying to forget those painful incidents entirely, or reject of believing that the difficulty doesn't exist or the hostile incident never happened. So avoidance of being away from those people or circumstances are accountable to make us worried by moving it up into unconsciousness. So, for instance, repress the experience of feeling displacement, taking it out of someone or something that is less threatening than the person who has really affected our hurt, frustrations, or anger or guilty desires or someone else, and then accusing him or her for it. So, in order to reject that, we have in ourselves in regression the temporary coming back to a previous psychological state, which is not imagined but a relief just. So regression can include the reoccurrence and either to a pleasant or painful experiences. So it is, according to Wally 2011, that it is a defense since it takes our judgment away from current trouble. Next is we have human accordance to Freud go through various stages of defense mechanism. So first is we have the repression, which is moto nga we only choose to remember, or we are having a selective memory and we choose only what we want to remember. So this repression adds because of ego's individual disturbing thoughts are kept away and becoming parts of our unconscious. And next is the stage of denial, which is refusing to face the fact. Individuals do not want to experience the reality. So example of that is a lover refuses to admit that marrying that person is impossible with the current condition. So a person is denying to accept what is the reality. Next is we have the projection. We're in the stage where individual attributing his or her own blame or anger on the other person, since ang superego trained person that to hate the other is not a good habit. So the person could blame the other for he or she is hating him or her. So this source of behavior can cause displacement in the individual's life. For example, so the cause of aggression may be satisfied by substituting the other person real who is not the real cause of anger, but individual taking out an anger towards him or her. So such satisfying ang so which consequently lead to a person to the temporary or long-term return of the ego to an earlier stage of development of particular experience instead of handling unwanted desires in more adapted way. So it is like projecting the blame to the other person. So next is the sublimation, which is the unwanted desires can lead affected person to a more positive, socially and ethically acceptable manners. So that is called sublimation. So it causes the person to satisfy his or her desire in substitution of the other sub-object. So for example, is the aggressive emotions which a person may put into more positive and constructive ways. So according to Holland 1999 in his article of the story of psychoanalytic critic, referring to his earlier work of the investigation, he claimed nga individual associating various symbols in literary work besides wishes and jealousy related to the post experiences that were other symbols associated with the literary text. So he thinks that Shakespeare have imaginary fantasy which may begin with pre-Oedipal, and this characteristic may have different level of fantasy. So that's why critics have looked out in literary work for identifying associative themes of this defense, which defense mechanism and the reader's response to them, because we have a different interpretation. Next is according to Holland 1999, the defense are the conflict different psychic agencies and reality which repress different sensory evidence. So we repress many incidents, we project different thoughts to substitution with opposite in result of different defenses. So he believes that there are different levels of defenses from pre-Oedipal stage. There is a different stage and level of demand processors are involved. So this literary text also results in a different level of fantasies which various form, text, and structure may transform the work of art into unified theme which individuals make meaning of the text and whatever individual reader is searching for. So that's why we have dreams and their symbols. So according to Freud, the content of dream is related to wish fulfillment, and the suggested that dreams have two types of content, which is ang manifest content and the latent content. So, um, Dreams became a way of expressing those repressed feelings which are unacceptable in real life situation because of our social, ethical, or any other restrictions. So moreover, Freud believes that the latent content of dream is repressed and concealed by our subconscious mind in order to protect someone from our thoughts and emotions that are hard to deal with. So Freud Freud also Freud also claims that in order to understand the dreams and to recognize their symbols, we have primary revisions of the dreams and it is vital, which in turn covers the displacement and condensation. Okay, so on the other hand, um, condensation, which describe as many different thoughts and concepts which are represented inside the length of a dream. Beside displacement and condensation, there is another procedure called symbolization. So, Freud illustrates that cunning symbolizations are procedure sensors the suppressed thoughts contained in the dream by counting objects that are meant to symbolize the latent content of the dream. So the second interpretation is the secondary revision. So during the last stage of dreaming process, Freud recommended that the bizarre element of the dreams are reorganized to make the dream more comprehensible, thus producing manifest content of the dream could have recognized by understanding in the role of psychic parts. And according to Holland 1999, he states that what we wish we also fear, and that what we fear we also wish. So which this wish and fear can be understood when we have unity with literary text. So we have also conflict with desires and ethics. This Latin symbol of literary text can be understanding when no one knows what he or she fears and wishes. So next is the proponents or notable people in the work of the psychoanalysis. So first is we have Anna Freud, which is the ego, psychology, and defense mechanism. So Anna Freud expanded her father Sigmund Freud's work by focusing on the ego rather than just unconscious desire. So she systematized defense mechanism such as repression, denial, and projection. He also emphasizes how the ego actively protects the individual from anxiety, applied psychoanalysis to children, helping explain early emotional development. So the contribution of Anna Freud is she made psychoanalysis more practical and um, observable to people, and especially understanding how people cope with their internal conflicts. Since ang work ni Anna Freud is wala lang siya nag-focus on how focusing on the ego, but rather than our unconscious desires, which can be observable or observed. Next is we have Erik Erikson, the psychosocial development, which is Erikson expanded Freud's idea into a lifelong development theory, which is you propose 8 psychosocial stages from infancy to old age, the trust versus mistrust, the identity versus role confusion. So his contribution shifted psychoanalysis from a childhood-focused theory to lifelong model of personality development. So integrating the social and cultural influences of his work toward toward Freud's by discussing the 8 psychosocial stages and implementing the or integrating social and cultural influences of psychology. Next is the Next is Erich Fromm, which is he combined Erich Fromm, which psychoanalysis with sociology and humanism. So argued that human behavior is shaped by social conditions and emphasized the need for love, freedom, and connection. So explored concepts like escapes from freedom, where people avoid responsibility and conforming. So the contribution is he made psychoanalysis more socially oriented, focusing on how society influences inner conflicts rather than just instinctual drives. So he argued also that human behavior is shaped by the social conditions, which is naka-affect ang culture and economic systems on how the way people behave. Next is Carl Jung, which is ang collective Carl Jung, which is ang collective unconscious and archetypes, which is Jung broke away from Freud and develops analytical psychology, which is identified niya ang archetypes such as the hero, the shadow, and the mother. So emphasize individuation, the process of becoming one's true self. So his contribution expanded the psychoanalysis beyond personal experience to include universal symbols and myths, so which is highly influential in literary analysis. So since he broke away from Freud's idea and developed his own analytical psychology. So next is the notable writings. So we have first the interpretation of dreams. So Freud argues that dreams are a form of wish fulfillment, expressing desires we cannot openly acknowledge. So he distinguishes between the manifest content, which is the actual dream images and storyline, and the latent content, which is the hidden psychological meaning behind the dream. So he explains how the mind disguises these desires through processes like symbolism, condensation, and displacement. So in his work, he explains how the mind disguises these desires through processes like symbolism. Okay, so this work establishes the concept of unconscious mind and the influence how we interpret the symbols and hidden meanings, especially in the literature. So next is we have the three essay on the theory of sexuality, where in his work, Freud presents his controversial theory of psychosexual development. So he argues that human development occurs in stages, which is the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage. So he introduces ideas like the Oedipus complex, where a child feels unconscious attraction to the opposite sex parent, and emphasizes the clear childhood experiences shape adult personality. So this text highlights how early development and unconscious desires influence the person behaves, which is crucial in analyzing the character's motivation or what drives them to do the certain action. Okay, next is beyond the pleasure principle, wherein Freud goes beyond the idea that humans only seek pleasure. Introduces the concept of death drive, which is the thanatos, so a tendency toward destruction, aggression, or repetition of painful experiences. So it contrasts it with the life drive, which is ang eros, so which promotes survival, love, and creativity. So it explains why people sometimes repeat trauma or harmful behaviors. Next is we have civilization and its discontent. So in his later work, Freud examines the relationship between the individual and society. He also argues that a civilization requires people to repress their instincts, especially aggression and sexual desires. This repression leads to unhappiness and inner conflict. So it also explores how guilt and morality are formed through the superego. So this text is important for understanding the themes and social conflict that drives control, morality, and personal dissatisfaction in the literature and society itself. Next is the issues or lack of first is the lack of scientific evidence. So one of the major criticisms of psychoanalytic theory is that many of its concepts are difficult to test scientifically. So ideas such as the unconscious mind, the defense mechanism, and psychosexual stages relies heavily on interpretation rather than observable and measurable evidence. So critics argue that this psychoanalysis depends more on subjective explanations than on objective data, making it less scientific compared to modern psychological approaches. So, for example, Freud believes that dreams uh, dreams reveal unconscious desires and conflicts. However, different therapists may interpret the same dreams in different ways, so making it difficult to determine which interpretation is correct. So, for example, as a student dreaming about failing an exam might be interpreted by one therapist as experiencing hidden anxiety, while other may connect to unresolved childhood trauma or fear. So this lack of inconsistent scientific measures remains a significant issues in the psychoanalytic theory. So next is we have the overemphasis on childhood trauma. So psychoanalytic theory strongly emphasizes the role of childhood experiences in shaping personality and behavior. So Freud believed that early interactions with parents and childhood conflicts greatly influence adult personality. So for instance, ang psychoanalysis may explain adult anxiety as a result of unresolved childhood trauma or parental conflict. However, modern psychological approaches recognize that these adult experiences such as academic pressure, financial or workspace, that stress can also significantly affect behaviors and mental health, not just about unresolved childhood trauma or parental conflict. So that's why a person who developed with low, or for example, a person who developed low self-esteem after repeated failure in adult life may not necessarily have unresolved childhood trauma, but the issues showing that personality continues to develop during childhood, and we have also considered the one of the factors as they develop their childhood. So next is the sexual and aggressive drive. So Freud proposed that human behavior is largely motivated by sexual and aggressive instincts. So according to psychoanalytic theory, the unconscious desires related to pleasure and aggression influence the emotions, decisions, and actions. So for example, Freud might interpret a person's ambitions for success as being connected to unconscious desires for power or dominance. However, modern perspectives suggest that these kind of motivations may come from positive goals such as personal growth, their passion, or social responsibility rather than purely sexual or aggressive instincts. So because of this, many scholars believe that this psychoanalytic theory oversimplifies the complexity of human motivation. Next is we have the subjectivity in interpretation. So these psychoanalytic methods often depends on the therapist's interpretation of dreams, the behaviors, emotions, and unconscious thoughts. Because of the interpretations vary between therapists, this psychoanalysis can become highly subjective. So for instance, the therapist may interpret a student's nervous laughter as defense mechanism for hiding insecurity, while other therapists may view it as a natural coping response to stress. Since there are no exact scientific standards for interpretation, the psychoanalytic conclusion may become inconsistent. So this subjectivity raises concern about the accuracy and the reliability of psychoanalytic treatment. So since there are various interpretations of the people, so this psychoanalytic is not consistent in result and there are no standard interpretation. So it's all about the accuracy and the reliability of the psychoanalytic treatment. So next is the influences. So first influence is the development of the modern psychology. So psychoanalytic theory greatly influenced the development of modern psychology, particularly in the areas of personality psychology, psychotherapy, and counseling. So the ideas being introduced by Sigmund Freud encouraged psychologists to study human emotions, the internal conflicts, and the unconscious motivations more deeply. So first is the development of modern psychology. Freud's idea um, opened a discussions about personality development and mental processes that continue to shape psychology today. So many psychological theories and other thea- therapies still borrows the concept from psychoanalysis, which is showing its lasting influence on the field. Okay. So next influence is understanding the unconscious mind. So one of the most important contributions of the psychoanalytic theory is the concept of the unconscious mind. So Freud proposed that people are influenced by thoughts, desires, memories, and emotions that exist outside conscious awareness. So for instance, a person may suddenly feel anxious in certain situations without understanding the exact reason. So this psychoanalytic theory would suggest that the unconscious fear or unresolved experiences may be the one influencing these emotions. So modern psychology and mental health studies continue to explore the unconscious processes through research on memory, the trauma, habits, and automatic behaviors, demonstrating the lasting impact of Freud's ideas about the unconscious mind, awareness, the subconsciousness, the preconsciousness, and the unconsciousness. So next is we have the impact on literature and arts. So psychoanalytic ideas influence literature, films, visual arts, and cultural studies by encouraging deeper exploration of emotions, the hidden desires, and symbolic meanings. So writers and artists became interested in portraying characters' unconscious motivations, emotional conflicts, and psychological struggles. So for instance, literary critics may analyze a character's action by examining their repressed emotions or unconscious desires. So in these films, dream sequence and symbolic imagery are often interpreted being a psychoanalytic concept. So artists and surrealists also were also inspired by Freud's ideas and the unconscious mind, so leading to the artworks that reflects imagination, fantasy, and hidden emotions behind those created paintings or literary pieces, or just by looking at a piece. So it has a continuous impact on the literature and arts by knowing um, what are the hidden emotions or the hidden messages with those literary pieces.